December 1969, Manhattan, 4:18 p.m. Traffic slowed for no reason. Frank Lucas noticed it before the driver did. A sedan stalled ahead. Another crept in too close behind. Then the sidewalks emptied. 10 men stepped off the curb at once, not running, not rushing, spreading out, calm, professional, jackets loose, hands low, the kind of men who didn't need to shout to be understood. This wasn't a robbery. It was permission being revoked. Lucas stayed still. The driver's knuckles turned white on the wheel. No one reached for a gun. They didn't have to. The message was already clear. For decades, men like these decided who moved product in New York and who disappeared for forgetting their place. Frank Lucas had skipped the introductions, skipped the tribute, skipped the rules. The leader didn't speak. He didn't need to. After a long second, Lucas pressed the button. The window slid down. Cold air cut through the car. Every man outside adjusted his stance. Lucas leaned forward and gave one order. Not a threat, not a plea, just a sentence that changed the balance. What none of them knew, what history would never write down, is that this moment wasn't the end of a warning. It was the beginning of something the old families could no longer control. In the late 1960s, New York was not a city. It was a map of invisible borders. Every block had an owner, every corner had a memory, and every man who survived long enough knew exactly where he was allowed to breathe. Frank Lucas understood those borders better than most. By then, his rise in Harlem wasn't rumor anymore. It was confirmed by numbers. Numbers that moved quietly through bars, barbershops, funeral homes, and cash-only storefronts. Lucas had done what many thought impossible. He had broken the old supply chain without asking permission. That was the first rule he violated. For decades, the Italian Mafia controlled heroin distribution in New York through a layered system of intermediaries. Street dealers never met suppliers. Suppliers never met importers, and importers answered to men whose names were never written down. Harlem, officially, belonged to black crews, but only on the surface. Beneath that surface sat Italian families who took their cut, whether they touched the product or not. Lucas disrupted that structure by going straight to the source. Instead of buying diluted heroin from Mafia-connected middlemen, he established direct access overseas. The product was purer, the margins were brutal, and the profits climbed faster than anyone expected. That kind of efficiency didn't go unnoticed, especially by men who had built empires on inefficiency that benefited them. By 1969, whispers started circulating downtown. Not police whispers, not journalist whispers, mafia whispers. Names were spoken carefully in back rooms. A new player. Too bold, too clean, no respect for hierarchy, no tribute, no introductions, just trucks moving, money flowing, and territory expanding without a single phone call to the old families. In the Mafia's world, that wasn't entrepreneurship. It was an insult. Frank Lucas, however, didn't operate like a man waiting for permission. He dressed conservatively, avoided unnecessary attention, and moved through Harlem like a local businessman, which he was. He attended boxing matches. He financed community events. He paid cash and left no paper trail. To most people, he looked untouchable. But power attracts gravity, and gravity always pulls enemies closer. On a cold afternoon in early winter, the exact date never made it into official records, Lucas was driving through Manhattan in a dark luxury sedan, the kind favored by men who wanted comfort without flash. The car was clean, unmarked, windows slightly tinted, but not enough to attract traffic stops. He wasn't alone, but he wasn't surrounded either. That was intentional. Lucas believed large convoys drew attention. He preferred minimal presence. One car, one driver, one principal, less noise. That decision almost ended him. As the sedan slowed near an intersection controlled unofficially by Italian crews, traffic began to behave strangely. One car stalled ahead. Another lingered behind. Side streets that were normally busy fell quiet in seconds, as if someone had turned down the volume on the city. Then they appeared. 10 men, not running, not shouting, walking, calm, synchronized, deliberate. They spread around the vehicle with professional spacing. No panic, no hesitation. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't spontaneous. This was containment. Each man was dressed plainly, but their posture betrayed experience. Jackets loose, hands low, eyes fixed on the car. 2 near the front, 2 at the rear, the rest positioned along the sides, controlling angles, watching reflections in the glass. Anyone who had grown up around violence would recognize the formation. Frank Lucas did. Inside the car, the air changed. The driver's breathing shifted. His hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look back. He had already understood what was happening. This wasn't about money. It was about permission. The Italian Mafia didn't announce confrontations publicly. They didn't argue through intermediaries when they felt disrespected. They sent messages in moments like this, moments designed to strip away witnesses, escape routes, and illusions of safety. Lucas sat still. From the outside, it might have looked like hesitation. From the inside, it was calculation. 10 men was not excessive. It was symbolic. Enough to make a point. Enough to guarantee control. Enough to show dominance without escalation, unless escalation became necessary. The men didn't draw their weapons. That was also intentional. They wanted him conscious, aware, listening. One of them stepped forward slightly, not the leader, but close enough to represent him. His eyes stayed on the driver, not Lucas. That too was a message. The real conversation would happen only if Lucas allowed it. Seconds passed. In those seconds, decades of underworld rules pressed against the glass. In the Mafia's worldview, Lucas had skipped steps. He had made money too fast, too independently. He had disrupted a balance that had survived wars, indictments, and betrayals. And now, standing around his car, were men sent not to kill him, but to remind him that survival had conditions. Inside the sedan, Lucas made a decision that would define everything that followed. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the window control. The glass began to lower. The driver's head snapped slightly, but he said nothing. He knew better than to interfere now. Cold air slipped inside the car. All 10 men adjusted their posture instantly. Subtle shifts, weight redistribution, fingers flexing, attention narrowing. This was the moment they were waiting for. Frank Lucas leaned slightly toward the open window. His face remained calm. No anger, no fear, no visible defiance. And then, instead of negotiating, instead of explaining, instead of apologizing, he spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally, just enough for the nearest men to hear. It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was a single order. And the men outside the car immediately understood that this was no longer a warning. It was a declaration. The order Frank Lucas gave was not dramatic. There was no raised voice, no profanity, no challenge thrown into the street. That was what made it dangerous. Men who survive in organized crime don't fear noise. They fear certainty. When Lucas spoke through the open window, the men surrounding the car didn't react immediately. No one stepped back. No one stepped forward. For a brief moment, New York itself seemed to pause, as if waiting to see which set of rules would apply next. This was not how encounters with the Italian Mafia were supposed to go. Traditionally, a confrontation like this followed a script. The target acknowledged the imbalance of power. Respect was shown. An intermediary was requested. A meeting would follow, usually in a neutral location, a restaurant after hours, a private club, a back room with witnesses who would never speak. Lucas skipped all of that. What unsettled the men outside the car wasn't just what he said, it was how little he said. The nearest man, not the leader, but the one trusted to read the situation, felt it immediately. The order didn't ask for mercy. It didn't acknowledge hierarchy, and it didn't recognize their presence as authority. It treated them as variables. That was new. In Mafia culture, disrespect didn't need to be verbal. Sometimes it came in the form of behavior that ignored tradition entirely. Lucas had just done that in front of 10 armed men. in broad daylight, in a city where bodies had disappeared for less. Still, no one moved. That hesitation wasn't weakness, it was evaluation, because by the late 1960s, the Mafia in New York was no longer what it had been in the 1940s and 50s. Federal pressure had increased. Wiretaps were more sophisticated. Informants were everywhere. The old families were still powerful, but they were careful, especially in public spaces. A public execution of a high-profile Harlem figure would bring consequences they didn't want, and Frank Lucas knew that. The men around the car were enforcers, not decision-makers. Their job was to intimidate, confirm defiance, and report back. Killing Lucas without authorization would have been reckless. Letting him walk without a response would have been humiliating. So they did the only thing that preserved control in that moment. They stepped back, not all at once, one at a time. Subtle, almost graceful. The formation loosened. The invisible cage opened just enough to allow movement. Traffic began to breathe again. Engines restarted. Pedestrians reappeared. The city reclaimed the space as if nothing had happened. Inside the car, Lucas didn't look back. He raised the window. The glass sealed the silence. The driver exhaled for the first time since it began and pulled away slowly, obeying traffic laws, blending back into Manhattan like a man leaving a business meeting. But the encounter was far from over, because confrontations like this don't end on the street. They continue in rooms where decisions are made. That same evening, word reached downtown. Not through phone calls, those were risky, but through trusted couriers and carefully phrased conversations. The message was simple and alarming. He didn't bend. To the old families, that meant one of two things. Either Frank Lucas was ignorant of how power worked, or he believed he had leverage they didn't yet understand. That question mattered. By then, Lucas's operation had become impossible to ignore. His heroin was cleaner, cheaper, and flooding neighborhoods at a pace that bypassed Mafia distribution entirely. Street-level dealers preferred him because he delivered consistency. Middlemen were cut out. Profit margins collapsed for anyone not connected to him. For the Italians, this wasn't just about pride, it was about erosion. If one man could operate independently, others would follow. The system depended on fear and dependency. Lucas offered an alternative: direct access, discipline, and ruthless efficiency. That was more dangerous than violence. Meetings followed, quiet ones. Men who had known each other for decades sat across tables and asked questions they didn't like asking. Where was Lucas getting his supply? How was he moving product without leaks? Why hadn't law enforcement stopped him? And most importantly, who was protecting him? Because no one believed he was alone. The Mafia had learned, painfully, that independent operators rarely survived without alliances. The absence of visible protection suggested hidden strength, and that made Lucas unpredictable. Meanwhile, in Harlem, life went on, but tension thickened. Lucas adjusted his routines. Routes changed, vehicles rotated, meetings shortened. He trusted fewer people, not out of fear, but out of awareness. He understood what he had triggered. By refusing to play the expected role, he had forced the Mafia to reconsider their approach. That bought him time, but it also raised the stakes. Retaliation would not come loudly. It would come strategically, and Lucas prepared accordingly. He reinforced loyalty with money and silence. He reminded his inner circle of one rule above all others: no unnecessary contact, no boasting, no names spoken aloud. Anyone who couldn't follow discipline was removed, because the next move wouldn't be visible, it would be surgical. What the Italian families hadn't yet grasped was that Lucas didn't see himself as a challenger to their power. He saw them as outdated. To him, the Mafia operated like a bloated corporation, slow, hierarchical, and dependent on tradition. He operated like a logistics network, fast, adaptable, and ruthless about efficiency. That difference in mindset would define everything that followed. Because when old power meets new methods, the conflict isn't resolved through force alone. It's resolved through who adapts first. And as both sides quietly repositioned, one truth became unavoidable. The The street encounter wasn't a warning to Frank Lucas. It was a test, and by passing it without raising his voice, he had ensured the next chapter would be written far away from witnesses, in places where silence carried consequences. Retaliation rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as coincidence. In the weeks following the street encounter, nothing happened, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. No threats, no messages, no bodies. For most men in Frank Lucas's position, that silence would have been comforting. For Lucas, it was confirmation. The Italian Mafia didn't rush when they felt challenged. They waited, studied, and then removed obstacles in ways that looked accidental to outsiders. New York had taught him that lesson early. Small disruptions began to surface across his operation. A shipment arrived late without explanation. A trusted courier vanished for 2 days, only to return shaken and evasive. A stash house landlord suddenly refused cash and demanded immediate vacancy, claiming pressure from downtown. None of it was direct. All of it was intentional. The Mafia was mapping him. By the late 1960s, Italian crews had perfected a method that avoided open conflict. Instead of striking the king, they destabilized the board. They leaned on drivers, port officials, warehouse managers, men who weren't loyal enough to die, but important enough to disrupt flow. Lucas noticed the pattern immediately. His operation was built on precision timing. When that timing slipped, profit margins tightened. Street dealers complained. Payments slowed. Tension crept into conversations that used to be purely transactional. That was the pressure point. The Mafia understood something most people didn't. Power doesn't collapse from attack. It collapses from friction. So Lucas responded the only way he knew how. He reorganized. Routes were redrawn overnight. Suppliers were compartmentalized, so no one knew more than they needed. Couriers stopped using personal vehicles and switched to rotating rentals paid in cash through intermediaries. Even long-trusted lieutenants found themselves suddenly isolated from information they once handled freely. This wasn't paranoia. It was doctrine. Lucas believed that loyalty wasn't declared. It was tested under inconvenience. Anyone who complained was removed. Anyone who asked too many questions disappeared from the chain without explanation. But even discipline has limits. What Lucas couldn't control was the environment. Downtown meetings were escalating. The Italian families weren't unified, but they shared one concern. Allowing Lucas to continue unchecked would invite imitation, and imitation would destroy the illusion of inevitability that protected them. So the strategy shifted. Instead of containment, they explored exposure. A quiet tip reached a local detective known for enjoying overtime. Another found its way to a customs official who had long suspected irregularities but lacked confirmation. Names weren't given, just patterns, just enough information to awaken curiosity without triggering accountability. Lucas had avoided law enforcement by staying invisible, but invisibility becomes difficult when too many people are nudged to look in the same direction. He sensed it. Traffic stops increased around his neighborhoods. Not arrests, just stops, questions, delays. The kind designed to make men nervous, to provoke mistakes. Still, nothing stuck. And that frustrated the Mafia even more, because it meant Lucas's insulation was real, which raised the question they had been circling for months. Who was backing him? Some suspected corrupt officials. Others whispered about foreign protection. A few even suggested he was feeding information to law enforcement, an idea dismissed quickly, but not without discomfort. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. Lucas didn't rely on protection. He relied on redundancy. Every critical function in his operation had a replacement. Every route had an alternative. Every man could be removed without collapse. He had built a system that didn't depend on personalities, including his own. That made him harder to kill and impossible to scare. The Mafia's next move was riskier. They targeted perception. Rumors surfaced in Harlem that Lucas was reckless, that he was drawing heat, that working with him would bring federal attention sooner than later. These whispers didn't come from Italian mouths. They came from familiar faces, men Lucas recognized but didn't fully trust. That was intentional too. Nothing undermines authority faster than doubt introduced by peers. Lucas countered with money. He raised payouts, paid early, paid clean, no arguments, no excuses. The message was unspoken but clear. Stability lived with him. Still, pressure mounted. Then came the warning he couldn't ignore. Late one night, a trusted associate failed to show up. No missed calls, no explanation. By morning, Lucas knew he wasn't coming. The body was never found, but the message was unmistakable. This wasn't street violence. There were no headlines, no sirens, just absence. That was Mafia language. Lucas understood what it meant. Escalation was no longer theoretical. The order he had given weeks earlier, spoken calmly through an open window, had traveled farther than he intended. It had reached men who did not accept being treated as optional. That realization forced a decision. Lucas could retreat, acknowledge hierarchy, and negotiate terms, or he could do what no one expected. He could make the cost of touching him unacceptable, not through violence, through disruption. Because Lucas had learned something the old families hadn't adapted to yet. In a city drowning in crime, attention was the most dangerous weapon of all. And in the next phase, he would begin using it, selectively, strategically, and without ever being seen holding it. What neither side fully understood yet was this: once silence breaks, it cannot be repaired. And the next move would ensure that whatever happened after would no longer be confined to backrooms or whispered meetings. It would ripple. Frank Lucas wasn't reacting, he was absorbing. That realization forced a recalculation. A senior figure, not a street captain, not an enforcer, finally authorized what should have happened earlier. Indirect contact. No threats, no show of force. Just a controlled attempt to understand the man who refused to play by inherited rules. The message reached Lucas through a neutral channel, carefully phrased, respectful, vague. A conversation was possible. Lucas declined. Not verbally, not aggressively. He simply didn't respond. In the Mafia's world, silence was usually a sign of weakness. Here, it landed differently. It wasn't avoidance, it was dismissal. And dismissal cuts deeper than defiance. Around the same time, law enforcement attention intensified, but unevenly. One precinct grew suddenly active, while another lost interest entirely. Investigations opened and closed without explanation. Files moved, stalled, then vanished into bureaucratic darkness. To outsiders, it looked chaotic. To Lucas, it looked familiar. Pressure was being applied unevenly because it wasn't coordinated. Different forces were pulling in different directions, some motivated by tips, others by curiosity, others by quiet incentives to look elsewhere. That fragmentation told him everything he needed to know. The Mafia was no longer controlling the board. They were reacting to it. Lucas used the opening. He narrowed his exposure further, reduced volume temporarily, and redirected focus to fewer, cleaner channels. Short-term profit dipped, but stability increased. Dealers complained less. Logistics tightened. Trust recalibrated around performance, not fear. That was when the Italian families felt it. Their influence wasn't being attacked. It was being bypassed. For decades, their power came from inevitability, the belief that no serious operation could function without touching their ecosystem. Lucas had proven that belief outdated, and once a belief collapses, enforcement becomes difficult. The final confirmation came quietly. A long-standing Mafia intermediary approached one of Lucas's distributors, not to threaten, not to intimidate, but to ask questions. Questions about supply consistency, about timing, about quality. That alone would have been unthinkable months earlier. The shift was complete. The order Lucas gave through that open window had never been about the 10 men surrounding his car. It wasn't even about the Mafia families themselves. It was about declaring independence without announcing war, by refusing to negotiate publicly, by declining private overtures, and by maintaining operational discipline under pressure. Lucas reframed the conflict. He made violence unnecessary and dominance irrelevant. The Mafia didn't lose a battle, they lost relevance. Years later, when law enforcement finally pieced together the scope of Lucas's operation, they would focus on logistics, international connections, and profit margins. What they would miss, or downplay, was the psychological moment when power changed hands without a shot being fired. That moment happened on a quiet street in Manhattan, when a man lowered his window and spoke one sentence, as if issuing an internal instruction. Because the most dangerous order is not the one that demands action, it's the one that removes permission. And once permission is gone, no amount of force can restore the old rules.